It began as a quiet confirmation buried in a routine palace briefing, one that aides expected to pass unnoticed. But the sudden tightening of language, the careful phrasing, and the absence of familiar names told a different story. Something fundamental was shifting inside the royal household, and this time it wasn't rumor. It was structural. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What should have been a forgettable administrative note instead carried the weight of something far more deliberate, almost surgical in its delivery, as though every word had been chosen not just to inform but to conceal. Because beneath the surface of that announcement, something else was unfolding, something that insiders had reportedly sensed long before the public ever caught wind of it. At first glance, the palace framed the development as a simple modernization effort, the kind of bureaucratic adjustment that institutions quietly implement to stay relevant in a changing world. But those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy began to notice subtle inconsistencies almost immediately. The phrasing was too careful, the tone too restrained, and most telling of all, certain names long associated with the machinery of royal operations were suddenly nowhere to be found. It wasn't just what was said, it was what wasn't. And in a system where continuity is everything, absence speaks louder than presence. Reports suggest that several senior aides, individuals who had served through decades of royal transitions, were selected for the position, were quietly removed from active visibility, their roles either reassigned or left deliberately vague. No formal announcements, no ceremonial farewells, just silence. And that silence began to echo. Because within palace corridors, where tradition often outweighs change, such abrupt invisibility is rarely accidental. Insiders whisper that meetings had been taking place behind closed doors for months, long before the public statement was ever released. Not routine discussions, but tense, drawn-out deliberations that stretched late into the evening, involving figures whose influence had long shaped the monarchy's internal direction. Something had been debated, something had been resisted, and ultimately, something had been decided. The kind of decision that doesn't just adjust a system, but begins to reshape it entirely. What made it even more unsettling was the shift in communication itself. Palace messaging, once predictable in its measured clarity, began to adopt a noticeably tighter tone. Statements became shorter. Language became more controlled. Even the cadence of official updates seemed to change, as though the institution was no longer simply informing the public, but managing a narrative in real time. Media insiders, particularly those who have tracked royal operations for years, began to suggest that something was off, a phrase that, while vague, carried a quiet urgency among those who understood how rarely such signals appear without cause. And then there was the growing divide, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. On one side, the traditionalists, those who had built their careers on preserving the monarchy's time-tested structures. On the other, a rising push for reform, for efficiency, for a streamlined institution better suited to a modern world. Reports suggest that this tension had been building steadily, not through public clashes, but through quiet disagreements, delayed decisions, and an increasing sense that the old system was no longer operating as seamlessly as it once had. It wasn't chaos. It was something far more controlled, and therefore far more significant. Because when an institution like the royal household begins to shift, it does so with intention. Every movement calculated, every change deliberate, and every silence meaningful. But this wasn't simply about staff changes, it was the first visible crack in a much deeper internal realignment. Behind the pageantry of the monarchy lies a machine few ever see, a finely tuned network of advisors, private secretaries and gatekeepers who quietly shape the crown's daily power. And now, that machine is being dismantled piece by piece. To understand why this moment feels so unsettling to those who know the institution best, you have to step beyond the ceremonies, beyond the speeches, and into the quiet architecture that has sustained royal authority for generations. Because the royal household is not simply a collection of staff, it is the operational heart of the monarchy, a system built not on visibility, but on precision, loyalty, and control. For decades, this structure has functioned with almost mechanical discipline. At its core are the private secretaries, figures rarely seen, yet deeply influential, acting as both gatekeepers and interpreters of royal will. They are the ones who decide what reaches the monarch's desk, who filter information, who shape responses before they are ever spoken aloud. Around them, a network of senior courtiers, administrative heads, and trusted aides work in quiet coordination, each role defined not just by duty, but by tradition. This is not a modern corporate hierarchy. It is something far older, something refined over time through crises, transitions, and the steady hand of continuity. That continuity, perhaps more than anything else, was the defining strength of the system during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Reports suggest that under her leadership, the household operated with an almost unbreakable rhythm, guided by a deep understanding that the monarchy itself was not merely a family but a sacred trust, an institution held on behalf of the nation. Every role, every protocol, every decision was anchored in that belief. Stability was not just preferred, it was essential, and those who served within this structure often dedicated entire lifetimes to preserving it, becoming not just employees, but custodians of something far greater than themselves. Which is why the current shift feels so profound, because when a system built on decades of consistency begins to change, it doesn't just affect logistics, it challenges identity. Insiders whisper that many long-serving staff members, individuals who have operated under the same principles for years, have struggled to adapt to the new direction. Not openly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the form of hesitation, resistance, and an unspoken question that lingers beneath the surface. What happens when tradition is no longer the guiding force? Reports suggest that some see the restructuring not as evolution, but as disruption, a departure from the very foundations that have kept the monarchy stable through periods of immense public scrutiny. And yet, others within the institution appear to view it differently. For them, the household is not being dismantled, but recalibrated, streamlined, refocused. A system that once relied on layers of protocol is now being pushed toward efficiency, toward clarity, toward a model that reflects a changing world. But even this perspective carries its own tension, because efficiency, by its nature, often demands sacrifice. Roles are reduced, influence is redistributed, and the delicate balance between tradition and progress begins to shift in ways that cannot easily be reversed. What makes this moment even more complex is the invisible nature of the change itself. Unlike public controversies or headline-making events, this transformation is happening within the walls of the institution, away from immediate scrutiny. There are no dramatic announcements detailing every adjustment, no clear roadmap offered to those watching from the outside. Instead, there are signals subtle, deliberate, and often difficult to interpret. A reassigned position here, a missing figure there, a change in how decisions are communicated. Each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Because at its core, the royal household has always been the monarchy's invisible backbone, the structure that allows the crown to function, to respond, to endure. And when that backbone begins to shift, even slightly, it sends ripples through the entire institution. The question is no longer whether change is happening. That much is clear. The question is what that change ultimately means, not just for those within the system, but for the monarchy itself. Which raises a critical question. Why disrupt a system that has held steady for decades? For months, something had felt off inside palace corridors. Meetings ran longer, decisions stalled, and according to insiders, a silent divide had begun to form, one that would soon force the palace into action. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, and it certainly wasn't public. That's what made it so unsettling. Because within an institution built on discipline and predictability, disruption rarely announces itself with noise. Instead, it lingers. It builds quietly, in delayed approvals, in conversations that stretch just a little too long, in decisions that once came easily, but now seem weighed down by something unseen. And those closest to the system, those who understand its rhythms, began to sense that the rhythm had changed. Reports suggest that at the center of this shift was a growing disagreement over the future direction of the royal household itself. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, steady divergence in thinking. On one side stood the long-serving aides, individuals who had spent decades refining the existing structure, who believed in its ability to endure precisely because it resisted sudden change. On the other side, a newer wave of advisors more attuned to the pressures of a modern monarchy, more willing to question long-held assumptions, and increasingly influential in shaping the conversations happening behind closed doors. It wasn't simply a clash of opinions. It was a clash of philosophies. Tradition versus adaptation. Stability versus evolution. And as these perspectives began to pull in different directions, the effects became harder to ignore. Decisions that once moved swiftly through established channels started to slow. Proposals were revisited, revised, sometimes quietly set aside altogether. Insiders whisper that even routine matters, those that would typically pass through the system with minimal resistance, began to encounter unexpected friction. It wasn't dysfunction. It was hesitation. A kind of institutional pause, as though the household itself was uncertain about which path it should follow. And in a structure where clarity is essential, that uncertainty created tension that could not remain contained for long. At the same time, external pressure was intensifying. Public scrutiny of the monarchy had grown sharper, more immediate, driven by an evolving media landscape that demanded transparency and responsiveness in ways the institution had never fully faced before. Royal correspondents, many of whom have tracked the palace for years, began to echo a similar sentiment. Something was off. It wasn't based on a single event or a specific decision, but on a pattern, a subtle shift in how the institution was operating, communicating, and responding. And when those who understand the system begin to notice patterns, it rarely points to coincidence. Then came the departures. Quiet at first, almost unnoticeable. A reassignment here, a retirement there, each one explained in isolation, each one seemingly routine. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became clearer. Figures who had long been part of the household's inner workings were stepping back or disappearing from their roles entirely. Not all at once, not in a way that would trigger immediate alarm, but steadily enough to suggest that something larger was unfolding beneath the surface. Reports suggest that these exits were not entirely voluntary, that some were the result of shifting priorities, of roles that no longer aligned with the direction the palace was beginning to take. And at the center of it all was a deeper question, one tied directly to leadership. Because under King Charles III, the monarchy has entered a period of transition unlike any in recent memory. His vision, shaped by years of preparation and a clear awareness of the institution's challenges, appears to lean toward reform, toward a more streamlined and responsive structure. But implementing that vision within a system built on continuity is never straightforward. It requires negotiation. It requires compromise. And sometimes, it requires confrontation, quiet, controlled, but no less significant. What makes this moment so critical is not just the presence of tension, but the way it has been allowed to build, slowly, quietly, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be managed through conversation alone. Because institutions like the royal household do not change easily. And when they do, it is rarely because of a single disagreement or a passing conflict. It is because something deeper has shifted, something that demands resolution. But tension alone doesn't trigger restructuring, something had to push it over the edge. Then came the moment insiders now describe as the turning point, a closed-door meeting where long-standing protocols were challenged and the future of the household was laid bare. It wasn't announced. It wasn't scheduled in any public-facing calendar. And yet, those familiar with the inner workings of the palace suggest it carried more weight than any formal declaration that followed. Because this was not just another discussion. This was the moment where tension stopped simmering and began to crystallize into something far more decisive. A line was drawn quietly, but unmistakably, and once crossed, there would be no returning to the old rhythm that had defined the institution for so long. Reports suggest that gathered inside that meeting were some of the most influential figures shaping the monarchy's present and future senior royals. Trusted advisors and key administrative voices whose decisions ripple through every layer of the household. What began as a discussion reportedly evolved into something far more charged. Not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but a firm, controlled exchange of opposing visions. On one side, the argument for preservation, for maintaining a system that had proven its resilience through decades of change. On the other, a growing insistence that resilience alone was no longer enough, that the institution needed to adapt in ways it had long resisted. And at the center of it all, a question that refused to be ignored. Who truly holds authority over how the monarchy evolves? Because authority, within the royal household, is rarely absolute. It is layered, shared, and often negotiated through tradition rather than declaration. But insiders whisper that during this meeting, those unspoken boundaries were tested. Discussions reportedly turned toward efficiency, toward the need to streamline operations, to reduce overlap, to create a structure that could respond more decisively to the pressures facing the modern monarchy. And with that shift came an implicit challenge not just to the system, but to those who had long upheld it. It is here that the stakes became unmistakably clear, because according to various interpretations of that meeting, certain key figures, individuals who had once been central to decision-making, found themselves increasingly sidelined as the conversation progressed. Not dismissed outright, but repositioned in a way that signaled a shift in influence. Their voices, once definitive, were now part of a broader debate rather than the final word. And in an institution where hierarchy is both visible and deeply ingrained, even a subtle change in who speaks and who is heard can signal a transformation far larger than it appears. At the same time, a reform agenda began to take clearer shape, one closely aligned with King Charles III's long-articulated vision for a more streamlined monarchy. Reports suggest that this vision, once discussed cautiously, was now being presented with a new level of urgency, not as a possibility, but as a direction, a path forward that would require not just adjustments, but structural change. And while the details remained tightly controlled, the implications were impossible to ignore. Because reform, in this context, does not simply refine, it redefines. What followed that meeting was a noticeable shift in pace. Decisions that had once moved cautiously now accelerated. Conversations that had lingered in uncertainty began to resolve with greater clarity. And perhaps most telling of all, the palace's approach to communication began to evolve once again, this time with a clear sense of preparation. Statements were crafted with precision. Language was calibrated not just to inform, but to guide perception. It was no longer about managing internal tension. It was about shaping the narrative that would inevitably reach the public. Because once a decision of this magnitude is set in motion, it cannot remain hidden for long. And those within the institution seem to understand that. Insiders suggest that what followed was not a spontaneous announcement, but a carefully coordinated effort to introduce the restructuring in a way that maintained stability even as the system itself was being reshaped. Every detail considered, every implication weighed. Because the risk was not just operational, it was symbolic. The royal household is not merely an administrative body. It is a reflection of the monarchy's continuity. And altering it, even in measured steps, carries consequences that extend far beyond its internal walls. And from that moment on, the restructuring was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. When the palace finally confirmed the changes, the language was measured, but the implications were anything but. This wasn't a tweak. It was a recalibration of power itself. The statement, delivered with deliberate restraint, spoke of efficiency, of modern alignment, of future readiness. But beneath those carefully selected words, a deeper transformation was taking shape, one that insiders suggest had been building long before the public ever saw the announcement. Because in institutions like the royal household, language is never accidental. It is crafted to reveal just enough while concealing everything that truly matters. At its core, the confirmation made one thing clear. This was not a temporary adjustment. It was a structural shift. Reports suggest that multiple departments once operating independently, each with its own hierarchy and traditions, were now being positioned for consolidation. Roles that had existed for decades, some even tracing their origins back through successive reigns, were suddenly under review. Not publicly dismantled, not openly criticized, but quietly assessed against a new standard, one that prioritized efficiency over legacy, output over continuity. And for those who had built their careers within the old system, that shift felt less like evolution and more like erasure. What made this transition particularly striking was how it was framed. Officially, it was described as modernization, a necessary step to ensure the monarchy remains relevant in an increasingly demanding world. And on the surface, that argument carried weight. The institution has faced growing scrutiny, heightened expectations, and a rapidly changing media landscape that demands speed, clarity, and adaptability. But insiders whisper that modernization, in this context, is only part of the story. Because what is being introduced is not just a more efficient structure, it is a fundamentally different way of operating. One that, according to reports, leans toward centralization. For years, decision-making within the royal household has been distributed, layered across various offices and roles, each contributing to the final outcome through a process that balanced influence and tradition. But now, there are growing indications that this balance is shifting. Authority is being drawn inward, concentrated among a smaller group of key decision-makers, creating a system that can act more quickly, but also one that leaves less room for the kind of internal debate that once defined the institution's strength. It is, in many ways, a move toward clarity. But clarity often comes at a cost, and that cost is becoming increasingly visible in the changing role of the traditional courtier. These figures, long regarded as the custodians of royal continuity, are finding their influence quietly diminished, not through direct removal, but through structural changes that redefine how decisions are made and who ultimately shapes them. Their expertise, once central to the functioning of the household, is now being weighed against a new set of priorities, ones that favor agility over tradition, responsiveness over ritual. And while some have adapted, others reportedly see this as a departure from the very principles that have sustained the monarchy through its most challenging moments. What is emerging, slowly but unmistakably, is a system that bears a closer resemblance to a modern organizational model than the layered, tradition-bound structure it is replacing. Lines of communication are becoming more direct. Responsibilities are being clarified, streamlined, and in some cases, reduced. It is a shift that promises efficiency, but also one that risks altering the delicate balance that has long defined the institution's internal dynamics. Because power, within the royal household, has never been about visibility. It has been about influence, subtle, controlled, and deeply embedded within the system itself. And when that system changes, so too does the distribution of that influence. The question now is not whether the restructuring will succeed in its stated goals. It is what will be lost in the process and who will bear the weight of that loss. Because while the palace presents a unified narrative of progress and adaptation, the reality within its walls is far more complex, shaped by individuals whose roles, identities, and futures are being quietly rewritten. But every restructuring has consequences, and not everyone inside the palace stands to benefit. Behind every structural change are the people who built the system and now find themselves pushed to its edges. For many within the royal household, this isn't reform. It's displacement. It's the quiet, unsettling realization that years, sometimes decades of loyalty, precision, and silent service may no longer hold the same weight they once did. Because while the public sees a streamlined institution emerging, those inside feel something far more personal unfolding. A slow, deliberate shift that doesn't just alter roles, but redefines worth. For the long-serving aides, the ones who carried the monarchy through moments of crisis and continuity alike, this transformation has not come as a dramatic announcement, but as a series of subtle, deeply felt changes. Reports suggest that responsibilities once clearly defined are now being redistributed, overlapping in unfamiliar ways or, in some cases, quietly removed altogether. Positions that once commanded authority are being folded into broader departments. Titles remain, but influence begins to fade. And in a system where identity is so closely tied to role, that loss is not easily measured, it's felt. There is no public outcry, no visible resistance. That has never been the way of the royal household. Instead, what insiders describe is something far quieter and perhaps far more revealing: a shift in morale. Conversations that were once confident now carry hesitation. Decisions that once felt purposeful now seem uncertain. There is, according to those familiar with the atmosphere, a growing sense of unease. Not panic, not chaos, but a steady, lingering question that hangs in the air. Where does each person now fit within a system that is no longer the one they helped build? And within that uncertainty, the divide that had been quietly forming begins to sharpen. The old guard, those who embody the traditions and rhythms of the past, now find themselves standing alongside a new direction that feels both necessary and unsettling. It is not a direct confrontation, but the tension is undeniable. One side holds on to the belief that the monarchy's strength lies in its continuity, in the very structures now being reconsidered. The other sees change as inevitable, even essential, arguing that without it, the institution risks losing relevance in a world that no longer waits for tradition to catch up. Neither side is entirely wrong. And that is what makes the moment so complex. Because as this internal shift deepens, the personal consequences begin to surface more clearly. Quiet exits continue. Not announced with ceremony, not marked by public acknowledgement, but happening nonetheless. Individuals who once operated at the center of the household's machinery are stepping back, moving into lesser roles, or leaving altogether. Some transitions are framed as retirements, others as strategic reassignments. But insiders whisper that behind each one lies a deeper reality, an adaptation not everyone is able or willing to make. And for those who remain, the uncertainty only grows stronger. Because if roles can change this quickly, if influence can shift this quietly, then nothing feels entirely secure. What makes it even more difficult is the emotional weight of it all. This is not just a workplace. It is an institution built on loyalty, on service, on the belief that what is being protected is larger than any individual. And yet, in moments like this, that belief is tested. Because when the system changes, it does not pause to consider the personal histories tied to it. It moves forward. And those within it must decide whether to move with it or be left behind. Still, from within the palace's inner logic, this upheaval is not seen as loss. It is framed as necessity. A difficult but essential step towards something more sustainable, more aligned with the realities the monarchy now faces. But that perspective, while strategic, does little to soften the immediate impact felt by those navigating the change in real time. And yet, from the palace's perspective, this upheaval serves a larger purpose. At the center of it all is a vision, one that insiders say has been quietly forming for years. A vision not just to preserve the monarchy, but to redefine how it operates in a modern world. It is not sudden. It is not impulsive. And according to those familiar with the long arc of internal discussions, it is not even new. What feels like a dramatic shift today may, in fact, be the culmination of years of quiet planning, of ideas tested in private, refined through observation, and now finally brought into motion. Because for King Charles III, the challenge has never been simply to inherit the institution, but to ensure it survives the pressures of a rapidly changing era. For decades, his approach has reportedly leaned toward modernization, though always within the delicate boundaries of tradition. Not modernization for its own sake, but as a means of maintaining relevance in a world that has grown increasingly impatient with institutions that resist change. Reports suggest that long before ascending the throne, he had already begun to question whether the existing structure of the royal household could continue to function effectively under the weight of modern expectations. Efficiency, accountability, responsiveness. These were not concepts traditionally associated with the monarchy's internal operations, yet they have gradually become impossible to ignore. Because the world is watching the monarchy today is not the same as it was even a decade ago. Public scrutiny has intensified. Expectations have evolved. The demand for clarity, for transparency, for visible purpose has grown louder with each passing year. And within that environment, the monarchy is no longer judged solely by its history, but by its ability to adapt. Insiders whisper that this awareness has shaped the direction now being pursued, pushing the institution toward a model that is leaner, more focused, and better equipped to navigate the complexities of modern public life. Not a rejection of tradition, but a recalibration of how that tradition is upheld. And within this recalibration, another influence begins to emerge. Reports suggest that Prince William's approach, pragmatic, measured, and forward-looking, has also played a role in shaping the broader direction of change. While not overtly dominant, his perspective appears to align closely with the idea that the monarchy must evolve to remain effective, that it cannot rely solely on inherited structures, no matter how enduring they may seem. This alignment, subtle but significant, creates a sense of continuity between present leadership and the future, reinforcing the idea that the current restructuring is not an isolated decision, but part of a longer-term strategy. What is becoming clear is that the vision driving these changes is not about expansion, it is about refinement. A smaller, more agile institution. One that operates with greater clarity, fewer layers, and a sharper sense of purpose. A system where decisions can be made more efficiently, where responsibilities are clearly defined, and where the monarchy can respond to challenges without the delays that once came with a more complex structure. It is, in many ways, a shift toward discipline, toward focus, toward a model that prioritizes function as much as it does form. But even within this forward-looking vision, there is an undeniable tension, because every step toward modernization raises a difficult question. How much can change before the institution itself begins to feel different? How do you streamline a system built on tradition without losing the very qualities that define it? Insiders suggest that this balance between necessity and preservation is at the heart of every decision being made. It is not a simple equation. It is a constant negotiation, one that requires careful judgment, patience, and an awareness that even well-intentioned change can carry unintended consequences. And that is where the true challenge lies. Because while the vision may be clear, the path forward is anything but simple. The monarchy does not exist in isolation. It carries with it centuries of expectation, of symbolism, of identity that cannot be easily reshaped without consequence. Every adjustment, no matter how measured, must contend with that weight, must justify itself not just internally, but in the eyes of a public that sees the institution as both timeless and accountable. But even the clearest vision must contend with the weight of history and the expectations of nation. What began as a quiet announcement has now revealed something far greater: a monarchy, not in crisis, but in transformation. And transformations, by their very nature, leave nothing untouched. What once seemed like a contained administrative adjustment has unfolded into something far more profound, something that reaches beyond staffing charts and internal roles, into the very identity of the institution itself. Because when the royal household changes, it is never just about the people within it. It is about what the monarchy chooses to become and what it is willing to leave behind. At its core, this restructuring is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader evolution, one that has been quietly shaping the monarchy for years. An evolution driven by necessity as much as by vision. The world surrounding the institution has shifted faster, louder, more demanding than ever before, and the monarchy, long defined by its ability to endure, now finds itself in a position where endurance alone is no longer enough. Adaptation has become unavoidable. And yet, adaptation comes with its own cost, because every step forward raises the question of what must be sacrificed in return. That tension between continuity and change now sits at the heart of everything. Because the monarchy has always drawn its strength from stability, from the sense that no matter how much the world changes, it remains constant. It is a symbol not just of leadership, but of permanence. And yet, permanence in a modern world requires movement. It requires adjustment. It requires the kind of transformation now unfolding within the royal household. But the challenge lies in ensuring that this movement does not fracture the very foundation it seeks to preserve. That in becoming more modern, the institution does not lose the essence that makes it recognizable at all. And this is where perception begins to matter as much as reality. To the public, these changes signal something significant. A monarchy that is not standing still, but actively reshaping itself to meet the expectations of a new era. For some, this is a sign of strength, a willingness to evolve rather than resist. For others, it raises concern, a quiet unease about how much change is too much. Because the royal household is not just an internal structure. It is a symbol, a reflection of the monarchy's inner workings made visible through its actions, its decisions, and now, its transformation. And as that symbol shifts, so too does the way the institution is understood. What makes this moment particularly defining is the way it bridges past and future. On one side stands centuries of tradition, of carefully maintained systems that have carried the monarchy through periods of immense challenge. On the other, a future that demands flexibility, efficiency, and a willingness to adapt in ways that were once unthinkable. The restructuring of the household sits directly between these two forces, acting as both a response to change and a signal of what is yet to come. It is not simply about improving operations. It is about redefining how the monarchy functions at its most fundamental level, and the implications of that redefinition will not be immediate, but they will be lasting. Because once an institution begins to reshape its internal framework, the effects ripple outward. They influence how decisions are made, how authority is exercised, and ultimately, how the monarchy presents itself to the world. This is not a moment that will pass quietly into history. It is a turning point, one that will shape the institution for years to come, long after the immediate changes have settled into place. What remains uncertain is not whether the monarchy will endure. It has proven its ability to do so time and again. The question is, what form that endurance will take? Whether it will emerge from this transformation stronger, more aligned with the world it inhabits, or whether the balance between tradition and change will continue to shift in ways that challenge its identity. Because in the end, the royal household is more than a staff structure. It is the living framework of a centuries-old institution learning, once again, how to survive. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.